Hey, welcome back to the MJM Ebikes YouTube channel. Today, in this video, we're going to be going over how to repair a tube for your hub drive e-bike. We're going to be showing you guys how to get the wheels off with the hub drives, to get that tube out of there, replace it, get it back in the bike, as well as I'm going to be showing you how to replace the front tube on the trike with the motor in that front wheel. I'll also be running over how to use a repair kit, so if you're out on the road and you're out on a ride and your tube gets punctured by something and starts to get a flat, what you can do to patch that hole up and get you to the nearest gas station to get some more air in there, or to the nearest bike shop so you can actually get a new tube put in there and continue on your ride. So it should be a quick, pretty easy video today, but let's hop right on into that one. So first thing, I'm gonna show you guys how to get that rear wheel off the ST hub drive bike to get that tube out. A couple things we're gonna need to do this. A pair of snippers, just to undo this zip tie right here that's holding the motor cable, and a 3/4 inch or 19 millimeter wrench. So first thing we're gonna wanna do is unclip that zip tie there. And that's gonna let us unplug the motor cable right here. First thing we wanna do, unplug that motor. Make sure it's unplugged before you try to take that rear wheel out. If you drop that rear wheel while this is still plugged in, it could potentially damage the motor cable, which is something we don't wanna do. So just always make sure, first thing first, unplug that motor cable. Then we're gonna go ahead and take off the little beauty plastic cap here, just on top of the nut. You can just slide that down the motor cable and set it to the side for now. Then we're gonna grab our 19 mil wrench and undo the nut here on the side of the axle. Take that nut off, the washer behind it. You can also take these guys off for now, set them to the side. And then for this next step, what I usually like to do is I like to turn the bike upside down. It makes it a lot easier to get the wheel out of the bike, as well as getting the wheel back in the bike once we're done replacing that tube. So I'm gonna now flip the bike over onto its seat and handlebars. Just for quick reference, when I say I'm flipping the bike onto its handlebars and seat, this is what I'm talking about. We're just gonna turn the bike basically upside down and let it rest on the handlebars and seat as if it were a tripod. It's gonna let the wheels point up, and it's gonna make it a lot easier to pull the wheel up and out of the frame and set it back in. When the frame is right side up and you're trying to essentially drop the frame onto the wheel axles, it's a lot more difficult to get that wheel on and off. So this just makes it a lot easier if you don't have a stand to get the wheel out, and a whole lot easier compared to everything else to put the wheel back in. Then just like we did on the other side, we're gonna go ahead and loosen off the nut on the other side of that wheel's axle. Get that nut off, set it to the side. Then all we gotta do now is take that rear wheel out of the bike. So to do that, you're gonna wanna make sure both nuts are off. You can use the kickstand as a little bit of a leverage, but you just wanna kind of pull up on the wheel and you'll see the axle raising up out. Pull up on the other side too. Maybe you need to jig a little bit. That wheel will come up. Your chain's gonna still be on that derailleur there, or on the cassette, sorry. Just pull it up and pull the wheel up and out of the bike. And there we have our rear wheel removed. Now let's get on to replacing the tube for this guy. So now I'm gonna show you guys how to get that tube that is busted out of this rear wheel to get a new one in there. So what you're usually gonna find yourself in this situation is with a flat tire. Probably because you rolled over something, some sharp object, a nail, a staple, wood, anything like that, punctured through the rubber and into the tube on the inside. The tube is just basically a big airbag that we're inflating inside the wheel to act as that air cushion between the rubber and the rim. So to get that guy out, because it's flat, we don't need to let the air out of the wheel. All we need to do, take off our dust cap. And this usually is done a lot easier with something like a tire lever. We do sell these at our shop, but you might not usually have these on hand while you're out on a ride and you need to get a tube fixed on the go. So the other thing we sell is a tube patch kit. This is something that we usually suggest everybody has on a bike ride, wherever you go, having it in your riding bag, just in case. You never know when you're on a trail if you're gonna pop your tire, and trust us, it's not fun when you're out riding and your tube pops and you're 10, 15, 20 kilometers away from anything nearby remotely, and you don't want to have to walk that bike out. So having just something like this in your little bag is beyond useful to have. Inside of it, you'll find two tire levers. These again are going to be coming very in handy right now. So I'm going to show you guys how to get this tire off the rim. With these levers, you can see they are basically just little pieces of plastic that have kind of scoops on the end. The scoops are designed so you can pinch the tire, get the lever underneath the rubber and get it up and over the rim like a little wedge lever. So basically all you need to do, get that lever underneath the rubber, pull it up, and then as it's over the rim here, we just kind of want to work our way around, pulling the whole rim through the tire above that rim. And there you can see, we have one side of the tire off the rim. Now, you can usually, once you know what you're doing, fix the tube at this stage. You don't necessarily have to take the entire tire off the wheel. For certain tires, it can be quite difficult to get them off the rim, especially for those road tires that are on there really, really hard. So for what we usually suggest is once you have one bead off the rim and on your other side, it's still on there, you can move it out and translate it essentially to be half on, and you can reach in and we can pull out that pop tube. All you gotta do is make sure that it's out of the valve there, the little valve is out of the hole, and we can pull that tube right out of the tire. So for demonstration's sake, I'm gonna show you guys how to repair a tube if you're out riding when something pops it and you need to get it fixed and patched up so you can get to the nearest bike shop or home to replace the tube itself so you don't end up damaging your bike more. We're gonna pretend that these pair of snippers are a nasty little nail that you're gonna roll over. Oh no, you're riding and now your tube is popped. You'll feel this probably because it's gonna start losing air quite fast to even out with the pressure of the atmosphere. So once you get a realization that your tube is popped, you stop, you get that wheel off, you find where that leak is on that tube, that's where the repair kit's gonna come in handy. So inside the repair kit, you're gonna find those tire levers we mentioned earlier, a rubber solution, basically an adhesive, a little metal sandpaper, and some adhesive tire sticky pads. So all we're gonna do is grab that little, first things first, we're gonna grab the little sandpaper. Once we find where that leak is and isolate it, what you wanna do is take that little sandpaper, the bumpy side that's raised, and just kinda rough up around where the hole is. Basically like you wanna sand down the rubber. As many of you may have guessed by now, this is so the rubber adhesive sticks to the tire, to the tube, sorry. Most flat surfaces, because they're not porous, aren't able to let an adhesive seek in to the surface area, like the little ridges on it, and create a better sticky surface. So what we're doing with this guy is essentially carving up little grooves onto the rubber to then have the glue fill in. Once we've got that rubbed up, we want to take a bit of our rubber adhesive, unscrew the cap. Opposite side of the cap is the puncture hole to puncture the seal. Just press in. That'll puncture it. Then I'm gonna go back to the tube with that glue, squirt a little bit out. Just get it on there, rub it around nicely. You can see, just getting some of that out there. Spread it around. Then we're gonna grab our little stickers. You're gonna wanna peel the back plastic off. grab that little rubber guy off of there. And we want to just patch it on there like that. Get it on there, hold it down, press it nicely around the edges. And there we go. Now that we have that adhesively stuck on there, we can put the tube back in the tire, and when we start filling it up with air, this piece is going to compress against the rubber of the tire itself, and it's going to create a micro seal on that hole. That's going to allow us to ideally get back to home where we have a new tube without a hole that we can replace this guy with, or a bike shop that can replace it for us, as this is not a permanent fix. This is just something that's going to help you ideally get to the nearest location and not destroy or damage anywhere else on your rim. So now that I've shown you guys how to do that, I'm going to show you guys how to get the tube, or the new tube, back into the tire and inflated and back into the bike. Now that we're back at home or at our nearest shop and we've gotten ourselves a new tube, we're gonna go ahead and put that guy back in our bike. So what you're gonna do is grab that wheel that we took the tube out of. On the rim, you're gonna find at some point a hole. That's gonna be where the, you may have guessed, air valve goes. So the first thing we're gonna wanna do is when we put in the tube into the tire, is make sure we're putting this valve where that valve hole is. So we're gonna grab the tire, tube, where that valve is, get it into the tire there. And what I usually like to do is get that valve fed through the hole again. Be a little tricky at first just to get it lined up correctly. See, once we've got it through, and we can see the valve comes through, grab that dust cap, cap it. That'll make sure it doesn't come back out on you, and we have a nice little point to feed the rest of the tube through the rim for. So now that that's in, all we're gonna wanna do is just get the tube into the rest of the rim. Another tip, this can also be easier to do if you put a little air in the tube first, giving it a bit more shape so it's not as floppy and easy to just fall out of the sides while we're getting it in the rim. But not everybody has an air thing on hand while they're doing this, so I'm gonna show you guys how to do it without that. So once we get the tube inside the tire, pretty much all the way around, we're gonna wanna get that bead of the tire now resat on the rim. So that's just gonna pretty much involve us pushing the sidewall of the tire back behind the rim. So when I talk about the bead, this is what we call the bead of the tire. The edge of the rubber where you see the little lip, that's what's gonna sit in behind the rim and grab onto a little ledge and allow the tire to not pop back out. So we want it all behind, so we push. See, that's what it looks like when it's seated behind the rim. Not in the rim, in the rim. So we want to work our way around the tire. Just get that bead fed through. And you can usually get it to seat pretty nicely by just pushing with your fingers all the way around. Check both sides, make sure the bead is sat as best as it can be right now in the rim. And then all we need to do is start putting some air in this guy. If you've seen our how to inflate your e-bike tire video, you're gonna know how this part goes pretty quickly. All we're gonna do is grab our floor pump, and with our 26-inch wheel, for reference, one thing we can always do, on the sidewall, we look for the writing that tells us the max and min pressure to put in the wheel. So as you can see, with a standard 26-inch wheel, we're gonna be wanting a minimum of 40 PSI to a max of 60 PSI. So we're gonna stick with 40 PSI on this guy, just because that's your pretty rule of thumb standard to go with most 26-inch by around 1.95 to 2.25 inch wheels. So all we're gonna do, grab our pump valve, dust cap off the wheel, push down to get a good seal on that valve. Lock the pump on. Then we're just gonna start pumping. But again, as you remember from our previous video, we're gonna monitor that bead the entire time we're putting air in to make sure it's seated on the rim correctly. Because if it's not, and we see the bead is sitting above the rim at any point while we're putting air in, that's gonna be a high likelihood that it's gonna jump off the bead. The tube inside that we're filling is gonna be able to work its way through the small little gap, possibly get pinched between the rim and the tire, causing it to pop once too much air gets in. And that's the thing we don't want to happen. So we're gonna pump it slowly, monitoring the bead the whole way, making sure it doesn't fall off. Being sure to check both sides while you're doing this, because you might miss it if the bead pops off on one side. And again, we don't want that happening. So always be watching both sides. And there we go. We're at 40 PSI. We can see all the way around that the bead is sat on both sides. We have no jumping issues. So we're good. That is the tire filled up. So just take your valve off, dust cap back on. And now we're gonna get to putting this guy back in the bike. Now, when we're putting the wheel back in the bike, there's a couple things we wanna note. First, we wanna make sure the wheel is the correct way when it's going in. It goes in one way and one way only. You have your brake on one side and your derailleur on the other. The wheel is gonna have the cassette or freewheel on one side and the brake rotor on the other. Hence, the brake rotor is gonna go inside the brake, the cassette or freewheel is gonna go into the derailleur here. When we're putting that wheel into the rear of the bike here, you can see here in the brake housing, there's a little gap between two green rectangles. Those are your pads. You're gonna wanna make sure you take the brake rotor of the wheel when you insert it here and have that rotor slide right in between both of those pads. If the brake rotor isn't sitting between those pads, the wheel's either not gonna go into the frame correctly, or it's gonna seat funny, or you're gonna end up with some rubbing on the brakes once the wheel is seated correctly. So we're gonna wanna make sure when we're putting that wheel in, we've lined up the brake rotor in between these two pads here. Other side, we're just gonna wanna make sure we grab that chain and we feed the motor cable through here because it has to sit in between, and we get this cassette in between the chains here. So like I mentioned, we're gonna grab that rear wheel. Make sure your disc is on the side with the brake and the cassette is on the side with the derailleur. We're gonna wanna get it lined up. You can see the motor cable here. We wanna grab that chain, feed the motor cable and the cassette into the middle of it, and we can just let it sit like that. One thing to also note when putting the wheel on is the axle here needs to get underneath the derailleur to sit right here. So you can see the derailleur's kind of in the way. So what we need to do is grab the derailleur, pull it back, and that's gonna allow the cassette, you can see, to slide down into there. Another thing to note is on your axle, you can see this piece here is keyed. It has a little notch at the top. That needs to be up. So when it seats into here on the frame, the bottom part without the notch goes in first. Part with the notch goes in at the top like that. So that's how we're gonna line up the axle to correctly seat straight down into there. We can then come around to the disc, make sure its keyed piece is straight up as well. Make sure your disc is lined up in the rotors. You might need to push on the axle a little bit to get it to seat properly, but as we can see, it starts to go down and it's dropped in. On this side, we can see the axle has properly dropped into the frame. The notch is on the top there. And on our other side, we can also see the axle has fully seated itself, notches at the top. We can then grab our motor cable, pull it up this way. Now we can put the washers and the nuts back on the axle. So to do that, we're gonna grab our nut in our washer. From the top of the motor cable, washer first, then the nut. Drop them down. And then we're just gonna get that guy threaded on there. And then we're gonna tighten this guy up with our 19 or 18 mil wrench. We can then come to the other side, grab that nut, get it threaded on there. Also, tighten it up with your wrench. You want these guys to be pretty tight because it's holding your wheel in place. We can then grab our little plastic beauty cap. Also slide that guy over the motor cable. Has a little slot like that. Goes through the bottom, then out the side. Get that guy capped on. Then we can grab our motor cable and plug it back in. So you can see on the bottom of the motor cable, there's a little arrow here. On this piece up here, there's also a little arrow. That little arrow. All we need to do to put the motor cable back together, line up the arrows when we're plugging it in. Arrows lined up. Push the connection together. You want the arrows to basically be that close to each other. We can then take another zip tie, stick it through this little hole here on the frame, and that's gonna hold the motor cable down. We just wrap it around there just so it doesn't flop around and get damaged. And that's the rear wheel installed. So now that we know how to do the tube placement on a hub drive bike, I'm gonna show you guys how to do it for a front hub drive bike. The process is basically the exact same. The only difference being with our TRF, our electric trike, is the motor is gonna be in that front wheel. So to get this guy out of the front of your trike, we're gonna follow a pretty similar process. You're gonna wanna have your snippers and your wrench. You're gonna wanna undo the zip tie holding the motor cable to the fork there. Zip tie off. And again, first thing we're gonna do, unplug that motor cable. Once it's unplugged, we can get ahead onto removing that front wheel to then get at that tube. So all we need is our wrench, and we just need to undo the nuts on either side of the wheels, axles, to get the wheel out. Same process on the other side. Loosen off the nut. Then we can just lift the fork off the wheels. Set the bike back down. And now we've got our rear wheel out. We can do the exact same process using our tire lever to get behind the rubber here. Pull out our tube, put in the new tube, get that wheel back on. We'll pump it up with some air, and then we're gonna drop the fork back on. So just as a quick run through, what we would do, we would take the dust cap off. We would then be able to lift this guy up, get the bead off, pull our tube out, put the new tube in, feed it through the valve hole again, cap it. Make sure that bead is sat back in the rim all around by just pushing in with your thumb. You should be able to get it back in. Once it's in, we can grab our floor pump, take off that valve stem dust cap, get the pump valve on there, locked in, and then we can start pumping up this tire. And again, we're gonna monitor the bead all the way around, making sure it sits. And with the fat tires, rule of thumb, we're gonna go to that 20 PSI if we're riding in dry, hard packed terrains, or if it's winter time, fall, there's some sleet, looser terrain on the ground, we're gonna go to that 10 PSI. You can play around with those pressures to figure out what you like best, but rule of thumb, anywhere between 10 and 20 PSI. So we're gonna slowly start pumping, making sure that bead is sat still. Again, as we get more pressure in, make sure that bead is correctly seated on both sides. And we keep pumping while monitoring. We're now approaching 10 PSI, so we're gonna just check our bead, as always. Everything looks good, so we're gonna keep pumping. We've now reached our desired 20 PSI. The bead has sat all the way around our rim. So we're gonna go ahead, take the pump off, put our dust cap back on. And now that we've got a new tube in this guy, we're gonna go ahead and put it back in the trike. So when we're putting this guy back in the trike, the one thing we wanna watch for is our spacers on either side. With the trike, you're gonna have your nut on the outside, followed by a washer, and then a locking ring. The locking ring, you can see, has a notch on the top. That we're gonna wanna make sure is on the bottom when we're putting it back in the frame, because the trike's gonna sit on either side like that. So we wanna make sure nut, washer, and locking ring are pulled out as far as we can, and this last washer is against the rotor there. We're then gonna line up the rotor with the disc, or the brakes on the one side, and we're gonna set the fork onto the axle. Other side, we're gonna make sure as well, nuts quite far out, washer, locking ring. We're then gonna line up the wheel with that frame again, grab by the handlebars, wheel underneath, line up that disc. As you can see in there, we're trying to get that disc to sit nicely in that crack right there in front of it. So you can see it's currently bumping on the housing on this side. So it needs to just be moved a little to line up with that line. As we do, you can see now that it's lined up correctly. It's now seated nicely in between the two pads, and our axle is correctly seated with the locking ring pointed down. All we're gonna do then is just tighten up the nuts on both sides with that locking ring correctly pointed down. And we're just gonna tighten it with the wrench. Get it nice and tight. And all that's left for us to do now is to grab our motor cable. Again, we can see there's a little arrow on it, as well as on the top one, another little arrow. We just want to line up those arrows and push in. Should be connected about that close together. And that's the tube replaced and the wheel reinstalled back in your trike. So there we have it. That's how to replace the tubes on both of your hub drive and your front hub drive e-bikes that you can find here at MJM E-Bikes. So if you ever find yourself out on the road or on a ride and you get a puncture in that tube of yours, you're gonna know now how to get that wheel out of the bike, get that tube out, patch it if you have a patch kit on you, and replace that tube once you get back home and you have a tube on hand, or how to get it to your nearest bike shop so they can replace the tube for you. So we hope this video helped. If you ever get stuck out on the road and you need a quick reference guide for how to quickly change that tube on your bike, this video is here to help you follow along and get it fixed so you can get up and riding as soon as possible. So with that said, that's gonna be all for today's video. Please like, comment, subscribe, leave a comment below on what you wanna see in the next videos. If you have any specific e-bike basics that you want us to run through in this e-bike basics series, we'd be more than happy to make some kind of video to help you get the most out of your e-bikes. So thanks, I've been Joey, and we hope to see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Cheers.